The following program is a UWTV classic.
From the University of Washington in Seattle, Upon Reflection.
Welcome to Upon Reflection. I'm Marcia Alvar. Lesley Hazleton is a psychologist and writer who once described herself as the kind of person who cannot see a mountain without wanting to climb it. British by birth, a U.S. citizen by choice, Hazleton lived for 13 years in Israel, where she shared her passionate observations on the Middle East as a writer for the Jerusalem Post, the New York Times, and Time magazines, and in several books. In 1989, she made the leap from foreign correspondent to automotive columnist when Lear's magazine hired her to write a regular feature called Carnal Knowledge. Hazleton's newest book is based on her experiences in the world of hot cars and hotter engines. It's called Confessions of a Fast Woman. And welcome to Upon Reflection.
Thank you.
When you were thinking of a title for this book, you could have called it Diary of a Fast Woman or Memoirs of a Fast Woman, but you deliberately chose to use the word confessions. Why?
Well, I have a bad habit of saying things that you're really not supposed to say, and I say them out loud and in print, and something tells me I've done it again with this book when it comes to speed and transgression.
Transgression is very much a theme of this book, and you explore it in different ways in all three of the sections of the book. In the first section, where you fall in love with hot cars, the transgression has to do mostly with gender.
Right.
Tell me about that.
I mean, how could any woman resist this field? You know, it's a field that's obviously stereotypically male. This whole idea that only men are really interested in cars, despite the fact that women buy half the cars out there on the market. And most of the automotive columnists and journalists are male. So it was like, here was another challenge, here was another boundary that I could cross, in the same way as I'd crossed boundaries before, and literal boundaries like Israel, Egypt, and so on. Here was another different kind of boundary that was just waiting to be crossed and sort of beckoning me. And of course it was combined with the boundary of speed, because there are so many levels of transgression inherent in speed beyond the obvious legal speed limit, and one of them was the gender one, being a woman in a primarily men's field, which gave it, I must confess, that extra fillip of excitement for me, sort of being in sort of something like forbidden territory, not quite forbidden territory, but getting close to that, right? But also, there is the transgression, the physical transgression of speed itself, because you know when you are driving really fast that your body is not built for this. You know it because the speed, if you're under fast acceleration, you're sort of slammed back against the seat there. When you corner hard, you've got this G-force pushing you from one side to the other, and your body maybe 2 or 3 times its normal weight, physically, when you're doing that. And you know you're not made to do this. So it's like you're trying to go faster and faster, push the envelope of speed further and further, push the envelope of what you are capable of. And this, I think, is very, very relevant to women, because it's something that men have been doing for yay long, right? It's almost the history of the human species. But women have really only been doing it in any considerable numbers for the past 30 years.
How are you received by the men, by the largely male world of the automotive columnists and drivers?
Well, the first time I turned up in my boots and my tight pants and this kind of leopard skin print and so on, they looked at me with, I suppose, a strange mixture of lust and suspicion. What is this, right? But in fact, they turned out to be wonderfully helpful. And I learned very, very fast. I had to learn fast because I didn't know anything at all about cars 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
There's a story that you tell in that first section that really spoke to the difference between you and the largely male world that you were in. You were in Sedona, Arizona, and it had to do with the unveiling of this new car that no one had seen, and how differently you and the men you were with reacted to it.
It was wonderful. I mean, some of these automotive journalists are really very nice, sophisticated, gentle men. And we were standing around that evening talking, I don't know what about. I was wearing these new earrings that I just bought, sort of cloisonné cactus
I think the men
things,
remember
right?
what they were wearing.
And I was wearing this new perfume, and everyone was saying how great I smelled and how great I looked and so on. And I was the sort of center of attention, and we were sipping champagne, which always gets me into trouble. In fact, it was on champagne that I first decided to write a car column. It's no telling what happens when I get to that. And only champagne, no other kind of drink. And this wonderful conversation was going, and then somewhere down the canyon, there was this roar of a very, very powerful engine, and somebody was kind of dropping the gear and revving it up and bringing it up towards us. And as it got closer, the men's eyes sort of glazed over, like they couldn't quite see me anymore, and they all turned in the direction of the road and started walking that way as though they were robots, as though something was pulling them there, almost against their will. And what turned up, of course, was the prototype of the Dodge Viper, which is this year's big, hot, lust, power car, right? This wonderful convertible muscle car, which is priced at $50,000 and is actually selling at $125,000. Comes any color you like, so long as it's red. It would be wonderful with you dress you're wearing today. And nobody had driven it. And nobody was going to drive it that day either, because it was being driven by the chief designer of Chrysler, whose baby it was. And he pulled up in it and kept the keys in his pocket. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, it's a pretty impressive heap of metal, I suppose, but, you know, let's see what it can do. I couldn't get the keys out of his pocket. I tried by several different means, but none of them were successful. And then I watched as one by one all these, as I say, very sophisticated men got into the car, sat in the driver's seat, strapped up the harness, it was a 4-point harness, and smiled for the photographer. And it was almost like kids in a sort of fairground. You know, you get into this thing, you have your photograph taken, you get out again. It was just the knowledge of what this car could do that was so exciting. But to me, it was just pointless. It was just metal. And if they'd given me the keys, if I could have taken off into the sunset in it in a flash of red, then I would have been as excited as they did. You know, but it just to have my photograph taken in it. And then I realized these were men who grew up with cars, for whom cars, ever since they were 5, 6, 7, had been something very, very special, who had always wanted to be involved with cars. And I had come to cars in my early 40s, right? In fact, had found myself a woman in her 40s behaving like a teenage boy with cars. So I hadn't had this history with them, this nostalgia for them. And what I saw there was this perfect male nostalgia.
You mentioned that you felt at that moment that you had crossed a boundary, that you were part of a world that you hadn't really been aware of. Mm-hmm. And it made me wonder, as I was reading that passage, if there was any kind of equivalent, if we flip the telescope around, if there was any kind of equivalent that a man in a group of women would feel that same way. If there's any field, any avocation that's so controlled by women that a man would feel the same kind of displacement.
I think there probably was about 10 years ago, and it's breaking down now. I mean, sometimes I'll write for the Hers column in the New York Times, and in the last few years they've started to run something that I call the His column. It's called About Men, but it's basically the His column, and what happened was that the men got jealous of the women for having their own column. Of course, the men had the whole of the rest of the newspaper, but they wanted their own special His column, so they got it, and now it runs one week Hers, and the next week, as I call it, His. And recently, most of these His columns have been to do with men trying to experience things that women experience, trying to be gentle. And of course, one of the major themes is childbirth, being there when their wives give birth and so on, being good fathers, relating to the infant and so on. In other words, men finding out that they're capable of something that it was always thought that only women were capable of. It's an exaggerated parallel. I certainly do not want to draw any analogies between driving a fast car and having a child. This is ridiculous, right? Though there are, of course, many analogies between driving a fast car and sex and having sex. You know, in fact, somebody once told me recently that they asked a series of F-18 pilots, which is better, flying an F-18 or sex? and these pilots had to think before they answered, and even then she suspected that they only answered sex because they knew that they were meant to and all the other guys were watching. It isn't that it's similar, it's just that you have that similar degree of physical and mental arousal, that similar degree of absolute focus. So it's not that they're similar experiences, but the mental and physical focus and completeness of the experience is similar, and therefore there is some kind of analogy there.
You mentioned a bit ago that champagne is part of what got you into all of this in the first place, but why you? I mean, here you are, you'd had all these years as a foreign correspondent, you're known for your writings about the Middle East and politics, which from the outside seems quite heady, and cars just doesn't seem quite in the same ballpark as that.
I think you burn out. I know that there are many people who feel proud to call themselves war correspondents. I don't think there's anything to be proud of in that. I covered 3 wars. So far as I'm concerned, 1 is quite enough. I also covered 1 peace between Israel and Egypt, which we talked about last time we met, and I'm far prouder of that than of covering any wars. And you burn out, which is one reason I moved to the States. And maybe I was lacking that something, that excitement, that high level of tension, of drama, of excitement. Certainly I found it with cars. The champagne was just, I don't want to sound like I drink champagne all the time. In fact, I have a very low tolerance for alcohol, which is why champagne so easily has this influence on me. But what happened basically was that somebody said, wouldn't it be interesting to see what happens when we put Lesley Hazleton together with cars? And since I'd always loved driving, but had never been behind the wheel of a fast car, because nobody, either rightly or wrongly, had ever trusted me behind the wheel of a fast car before. I said, sure. And at first I thought, well, let's see if this lasts 3 months. And then I said, well, let's see if it lasts another 6 months. And then after a year, I knew I was utterly hooked on speed and had no option but to continue.
Your book, though, isn't just about being hooked on speed, because you go through a number of stages of familiarity with cars. And in the second section of the book, you actually go to work for a time as a mechanic and...
Well, a mechanic's apprentice.
A mechanic's apprentice.
Right. And like the sorcerer's apprentice.
And this transgression involves not only gender, but it involves class.
Right. What I wanted to do was... I knew I was going too fast on the public highways. I knew I was going to have to restrict my really, really fast driving to the track. And one way I thought I could do that was if I could understand, if I could get into the belly of the beast, as it were, if I could understand cars from the inside, then maybe I would begin to understand more about my own addiction to speed. So I apprenticed myself to these wonderful people, this mechanic shop up in Montpelier, Vermont. And there too, as you say, there was the transgression not only of gender but also of class. I would see people come in there, and sometimes I would be, I would have my pink mechanic's rag hanging out of my pocket. I'd be covered with oil stains and so on. And sometimes I'd be the only one without my head under a hood and so on. And a customer would come in and would approach me to ask how his car was doing or her car was doing. And very often it reminded me of a day that I spent with an oncologist friend in the hospital, following him around in order to write a piece about a day in the life of an oncologist. It reminded me very much of how people would approach him. It was almost, how's my little car doing, doctor?
You have the knowledge, tell me what's happening.
And this is a relationship that is only good so long as the little car is out of order. Before the time that little car is out of order, it's almost as though the class system is reversed. The person with money, the person with the Mercedes-Benz or the Porsche comes in and is surrendering their terribly expensive machine to the good graces, the knowledge, the skill, and the ability of this person who earns maybe 10%, maybe 5% of what they earn. So we're sort of sucking up to them, sort of putting them up on a pedestal, and then of course the moment the car is fixed, here's your $20 or $50 tip. I'm out of here. See you again, guy. Right?
Your friends also had a different reaction. I mean, it was one thing when you were driving hot cars and dabbling in driving on a track in hot cars, but when you said you were going to actually go and get your hands dirty, they had something of a different reaction.
Yeah, I would say almost shock.
Why would you want to do that?
They would call me a motorhead, a greasehead. They'd say I'm just going too far. It was sort of like, so long as I was driving the Lamborghinis, the Ferraris, the Porsches, the Dodge Vipers and so on, this was sort of glamorous somehow. I'm very suspicious of this whole thing about glamour and fast cars, by the way, but we can get into that later. But the minute I wanted to actually find out what made them run, it was almost as though you can admire someone's beautiful body, but if you open it up and you see the blood and the gore and so on, that is disgusting. Right? It's almost so the same thing was being applied to cars. And again, there I was transgressing this boundary of class. It's upper class to drive these terribly expensive machines. It is lower class to get inside them and get your hands dirty. And of course, people prefer to forget that these things are filthy. They pollute the environment like God knows what. We are ruining the atmosphere with these machines. Up to 60% of the pollution in the major cities is because of cars.
And thus we get to the greatest transgression of them all, which is dealt with extensively in the third section of the book, where you look at future cars and what they might be like. And that was really a transgression against yourself, against your own values and what you had always felt was important.
Because I've always considered myself an environmentalist. I wrote one book about the desert as a passionate defense of the desert and of desert culture, desert life. So I was a bit shocked to find myself hooked on something that was creating so much pollution, that was so environmentally dangerous, as I'm convinced it is. So I began to try and find out more and more about alternative fuels and alternative vehicles, such as solar and electric vehicles. And in fact, you can make very fast solar and electric vehicles. In fact, there's a car that, God knows I have no interest in defending or in promoting General Motors for many obvious reasons, but General Motors are bringing out a car, the Impact, in 1994. They've now committed themselves to that date. An electric car that can go faster than the Mazda Miata. It can accelerate, that is, from 0 to 60 miles an hour faster than the Mazda Miata. A lovely, stylish little thing. Question is, where is the infrastructure? Will people actually buy it? How much more will they pay for a car that is environmentally respectable than a car that ruins the environment? There's lots of people who say that, yes, the environment's a great thing and we will do all kinds of things so long as it doesn't cost us any money, so long as we don't have to put ourselves out. But still, that something is going to be missing, that visceral vibration literally through the seat of your pants, right? That vroom vroom, that very, very basic visceral quality of power is going to be missing. It's going to be so sophisticated, so technologically advanced that I'm going to miss it. Even though the intellectual and the socially responsible side of me says, yes, this is excellent, there's some more atavistic side of me. That's the side that's hooked on speed. That's the side I call the demon that is going to miss it terribly. And I don't know if that in me or in other people is going to be able to make this break. And that's why I think it's so important to understand this demon. It's one thing to say, well, of course, this woman is horrific. She shouldn't be doing these speeds. She shouldn't be driving these cars in the first place. But the fact is that people do, and there's a good reason for it. They are addictive. They are terribly seductive.
They're like a drug.
Exactly. And unless we can understand why, we won't be able to free ourselves of them. We won't be able to clean up this planet.
In addition to the misgivings, very serious misgivings you have about cars in relation to the environment and pollution, another sort of darker vein emerged in the book, where you said these cars really brought out a side of you that you hadn't known you had and you really didn't like very much when it showed up.
Yeah, this is where it comes to, you asked why I call this book Confessions of a Fast Woman. Believe me, I did not like writing this, though I had to admit that it was true. Something happens inside your mind when you're at the wheel of a really powerful car on a public highway. I mean a car that's capable of easily going twice the speed limit, if not far more. And you're driving it as hard as you can. Let's say the person who's in the outside lane is going 70, 80 miles an hour. They themselves are breaking the speed limit, but say they're going 70 or 80 miles an hour. And you're coming up behind at 140, 150, 160 miles an hour. Let's leave aside matters of judgment for the moment. The car is capable of this. So you sometimes find it almost irresistible because you are addicted, because you are so seduced. You do this. Not often, but whenever you can get away with it. Reprehensible, but nevertheless, it happens. So let's try and look at it a moment without judgment. You come up really fast behind the car in front. And I have been in the car in front, so I know what it's like too. The car in front, the driver looks in his or her rear mirror and sees a car there that simply was not there a split moment ago. Thinks, oh my God, what's happening? Does a sort of wobble on the road and veers over into the middle lane or the inside lane as fast as that driver possibly can. Now, if you were the driver of the other car, the faster car, and you go soaring on by, there is almost inevitably a feeling of you have been given your due. You are the master of the road, the master of the universe. This other car has given sway, has announced your superiority on the road, and you go shooting on past as though you own the road is yours. You are undisputed king of the road. And there have been many romantic songs about being king of the road. But think about what it means for a moment. It is absolutely antisocial. And it's funny, you know, in the United States, the strongest social pact in such a very libertarian country is the rule of the road, which for the most part is obeyed without enforcement. We all obey the rules of the road because that is the way that we can all drive more or less safely on the road. You were totally breaking this when you were going at such speeds. You are under what I call the pathetic illusion that the power of the engine is your power. The power of the engine is making you more powerful.
It's kind of the fascism of the road.
It is indeed. I would say it is almost a fascistic feeling, and I think it's no accident that Hitler, and you may call this demagoguery, but I call it no historical accident, that Hitler used race cars, the auto union race cars, as one means of establishing the superiority of the Nazi regime. Used, in fact, Ferdinand Porsche, the founder of Porsche cars, to develop these cars. He also later developed the buzz bombs that terrorized London during the Blitz. All throughout the 30s, these cars dominated the European race circuit. And therefore, Hitler himself in Germany was more powerful because he had the more powerful cars, and there was no Jesse Owens to blow them off the track.
This book, it's about a lot of things, but it's about motion and it's about movement, and that's so much a part of your own life. I mean, born in one country, lived in another for 13 years, moved to this country, became a citizen. What's the attraction of that motion to you? Why is movement so important?
I don't know. Maybe one day I'll write a brilliant book of philosophy that'll put it all together, but somehow it happens a little bit in each book. And it's one of the things I've tried to get at here in Confessions of a Fast Woman is, what is the seduction of motion, especially of rapid motion, of fast motion? Why is it so exciting? What is it about it that is so addictive, so exciting, so seductive, so, in a way, almost sexual? It's almost as though I cannot see a boundary. As you said at the beginning, I can't see a mountain without wanting to climb it. I can't see a boundary without wanting to cross it. And I have to confess, one reason I'm moving to Seattle now, which I am in just 3 weeks' time.
Still in motion.
Again. No, but I think it's a fairly permanent move this time. But I got my pilot's license here this summer. And it is such a wonderful place to fly. And back east is so horrendous by comparison that I just had to move out here.
You find moving and motion very attractive. It's funny because a lot of people would think your kind of life is very wrenching and would associate stability with intimacy and deep ties. But you wrote once, actually, when you were out in Puget Sound visiting, that you were poor on permanence, but you were rich on intimacy because of the way you lived.
Yeah.
And people might find it puzzling. Well, how can you find intimacy when you're moving around all the time?
People are always there. I am just blessed with the most wonderful friends everywhere I go, and the wonderful friends stay wonderful friends, and it's almost as though we just pick up where we left off each time. And it's a give and take. You can stay in one place and put down very, very deep roots, or you can put down medium-sized roots in many different places, which is what I seem to have done. But it's almost as though I seem to be spending my life, I don't know, maybe I'm trying to lead my life like a cat, trying to pack 9 lives into one. I'm not quite sure. It just seems to me that we're given so short a time or I'm given so short a time on this planet. I just want to keep on finding out what more can I do? What next boundary is there for me to push? Let's see how far I can go.
We have very little time left to talk today, but I did want to ask you, you use the myth of Icarus in your book. You use it in a couple of different ways. Could you talk about that, about the seduction of the speed and the height, and then perhaps the Icarus of the future?
Well, this of course is what I have to keep in mind, because the myth of Icarus is a very valuable one. It's lasted so long since the ancient Greeks simply because it is so applicable. Icarus, of course, son of Daedalus, who put wax wings on both of them so as they could escape from prison in Crete over the Aegean Sea, warned his son as they were flying not to fly too close to the sun. Don't go too high, or the sun will melt the wax and you will fall. And of course, Icarus, being a teenager, did what all teenagers do, flew too high and tumbled down and was killed. So it's almost as though and I think many other people, and maybe what I'm doing and what many other people do is doing this for those who prefer not to do it but need other people to do it for them, need people who will fly not quite too high but just almost too high, risking that limit there, almost getting their wings melted but not quite. Let's see how far you can go. So let's see what happens.
And a different Icarus towards the end of the book, a very 20th century Icarus who may fall because of the pollution that gathers on the wings because of the cars that we're driving. It's a wonderful book. I really enjoyed it. Lesley Hazleton, the author of Confessions of a Fast Woman. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
To see more UWTV classics, visit uwtv.org/classics.